Hi everyone, there's some big news regarding Flared2. I finally managed to do what I thought was impossible until recently, and I have to thank a customer who pushed me to find this solution, an agency from Istanbul, if I'm not mistaken, so thanks to them. I also have to thank BlenderKit.com for this fantastic model that comes directly from their add-on. From their site, you can download many well-made scenes and models for free, like this one I'm using for my demo videos. In this model, as you can see, we have a sun projecting a flare within this animation. Right now, I haven't activated the obstacle, so the sun is actually projecting through the obstacle. But if I want to, I can go to Obstacle and select the collection that creates the obstruction, which should be this one. Let's set it to 0.05. There, it should work now. The sun is visible when it's clear and hides when it's obstructed by the guardrail. Okay, the problem is this. When we have a scene like this, and the scene needs to be rendered using the depth of field of our camera, which is currently missing, and I'm going to activate, the depth of field unfortunately also affects the flare. This is because the flare is positioned in the space immediately close to the camera. This is where the flare occurs, and this area is heavily influenced by the depth of field. So the flare stays completely blurred, and until now we had no solution for this. But we finally found one. It's a workaround because there is no way to force Blender to avoid applying depth of field to just one object. But you can do this. As many of you already know, we have an advanced render option here that allows us to render flares on a separate level, on its own. This function was initially conceived to allow us to composite the final image in another program, to export the flare separately from the image. I discovered over time that it could also be very useful to speed up the flare render. Since we have these very high transparent light path values, the cycles render slows down a lot, also depending on the hardware we have. By rendering the flare on a separate level using only Eevee simultaneously with our scene, which can be rendered in cycles or Eevee without problems. By clicking on this, we create an extra level that will contain only a copy of the flare, which will be rendered by itself with Eevee, and we keep this scene as it is. When it renders, the flare we see here will be deactivated, so that the compositor automatically takes our cycles scene and applies the flare rendered with Eevee without us even noticing. Here, it asks if the compositor nodes should be created directly by Flared2 or if we want to do it manually. And here the answer is, if you're a compositor expert and you know how it works, and more importantly, if you already have a structure inside the compositor for this scene, then you should manually composite the two nodes needed to render the flare separately. If instead you want Flared2 to do everything and you don't have nodes in the compositor yet, like now where there's nothing, you can let Flared2 do it, which is more convenient. So I'll click OK. Flared2 modifies the compositor and inserts this very simple node tree. We have the render of the car from the cycles scene, the flare render in Eevee, the add overlay between the two, and the final output. Let's do a quick render to see what happens. I'm just going to lower the samples here so that we don't have too many and the render is fast. Perfect, that's fine. Let's see what happens. This is blurred, and that's the problem we identified. It's a different kind of blur than what we see here, because since we forced the flare render in Eevee, and so the flare is now being rendered in Eevee, it's a different kind of blur, but it's still not what we want. This is because the Eevee level is currently rendering this flare with depth of field, and some blur too, it seems. Anyway, it's not good. Remember that you should never touch this scene because you might break the mechanism that's creating this, which allows us to work on two separate levels. We continue working here, although we must remember that what we'll see when the flare renders is what we see here without the camera's depth of field. The flare will look like this. To achieve this, we still need to modify a parameter that I've inserted directly here. Enter 0 to deactivate depth of field while rendering. This is actually nothing more than the parameter we have in the EV scene when we go to depth of field and have this max size. Here, the same parameter is modified, if you look, and we can do it directly here without having to go into the EV scene, which, as I said, should not be touched. When this parameter is 0, we're telling EV that there should be no blur on the flare rendered by EV. So, if I check here, I'll see that the flare is now clean, whereas before it was blurred. And at this point, we should see the magic I mentioned before that we couldn't see. Because when I render this now, it will be perfect. No, a crash. Okay, I'll explain why. The crash was a blessing in disguise because it allows me to explain what this new added entry is, which is no small thing because we managed to catch and resolve another problem we've had for a long time. The render always freezes if you use a Mac, at least from my experience. We discovered this thanks to my friend Alfonso, who found this information, I think, on the forums. We discovered there's a problem related to lock interface, which is a function that Blender already provides here. I had never used it in my life, but it's useful when working on a double scene, especially on Mac. Although, as you saw before, it crashed on PC too, so it's possible to lock the interface before a render. This is a game changer and prevents possible crashes that I always get on Mac, while on PC they're very rare. So now I activate Lock Interface. This means that while Blender is rendering, the interface is not operational. Keep this in mind and use it as you wish. So now let's look at the magic I mentioned before that we couldn't see. Here it is. This is what we wanted to have. This is Cycles rendering the scene with the flare added on top. One of the ugliest flares I've ever made. Forgive me, but I was focusing exclusively on the experiment. So shortly, this version will be released for free. It's 114062, unless something else changes or there's still a need for some fixes. For any questions you have regarding this, write to me and talk to me. Let me know. I'm always curious about your experiences and the feedback you give me. This was born from feedback. Thanks a lot. Happy holidays. Merry Christmas to everyone. Bye-bye. I'll quickly add a piece to this video that I forgot. Let me show you this. As you can see here, we have a flare. I can move through the timeline, and as you can see, something happens here that shouldn't, but it can happen, namely this. The flare has disappeared. It's intersecting with the guardrail, which shouldn't happen. If we look from above at what's happening to our camera now, you can see what the problem is. The flare is positioned here, and right here it's intersecting with the guardrail. We have a function that was designed specifically to help when these problems occur, which moves the flare plane further back in the camera. It's this close range scene. I'll activate it. In fact, everything is fine here, although it's not perfectly identical, in the sense that there is still an intersection. Right now it's not visible, but if the object were in this camera space, we would have an intersection again. And what's more, activating close range scene slightly modifies the flare's appearance, because if we go back a few frames and look at the flare without close range scene, and with it, you see that right now, for example, it changes intensity. So there's another way, which is what I explained in this video. Let's take this frame here where the intersection is very evident. Let's activate the flare render on a separate level again. Let it build the node setup. Remember to set depth of field to 0 and lock the interface. And at this point, let's try to render and see what happens, because by moving the flare to a separate level, we will no longer have the problem of intersection with objects. And indeed, right now, if we go to the separate scene and go to the same frame, which is 71, we see that here the frame is complete because there is no intersection. So going back to this scene and rendering, let's see what happens. This is perfect. This function also serves to avoid unwanted intersections. Thanks. Yeah, bye.